Victims of the Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, shot down by Iran 4 years ago today, were honored at a ceremony.
Mahsa Amir Liravi, 30. Farid Araste, 32.
All 176 people on board died, including 85 Canadian citizens and permanent residents. Thomas Dagla takes us now through how they're being remembered and Ottawa's bid to hold Iran accountable.
Well, it was an emotional ceremony here in Richmond Hill, Ontario, as families who lost loved ones on that Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752 that was shot down near Tehran. They gathered here and remembered their loved ones. Each of those names read out with the smiling pictures of the victims, their ages, all read out for the families here. And sometimes the people speaking who themselves lost loved ones on that flight, they had to stop, gather their thoughts, and continue reading their remarks since it was so difficult to make it through that list. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in attendance, speaking directly to three mothers who lost family members in the downing of that flight, appearing to open the door to the federal government here in Canada, designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. The federal government has signaled that they are open to that, but they have not moved in that direction yet. It is something that families have been demanding for years, but that Ottawa has simply refused to do so far. Justin Trudeau, in his speech here in Richmond Hill, tied the IRGC to two organizations that Ottawa does consider terrorist groups, that is Hamas and Hezbollah. Here's Justin Trudeau speaking earlier.
An Islamic Republic regime that continues to disregard human rights in Iran and continues to destabilize global peace and security through its support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and other proxies around the world.
Those listening closely heard Trudeau speak a few words of Farsi for those here in attendance, specifically the words "woman, life, freedom," which became a rallying cry for those in Iran protesting against the regime after the death in police custody in 2022 of Mahsa Amini. Now, going forward, the families of the victims on Flight PS752 say they want the support of Canada and the other countries that lost residents and citizens on that flight, Sweden, UK, and Ukraine. The families taking this case to the International Criminal Court. They want the downing of that flight considered or at least investigated as a war crime. Canada and those other countries jointly now taking this case to ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. The government, including Trudeau here today, presenting that as a step forward. As Trudeau says, and I'm paraphrasing here, the Iranian regime must be held accountable for all those deaths 4 years ago today. Thomas Dagla, CBC News, Richmond Hill, Ontario.
For more on this, I'm now joined by Kaveh Shahrouz. Kaveh is a human rights activist and lawyer and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a member of the Legal Advisory Committee for the families of PS752 victims. And we've reached him in Toronto tonight. Good to speak with you.
Good to be with you.
So, Kaveh, let's begin with something that the families have long been asking for, and that is the listing of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, for those who are unfamiliar, listing it as a terrorist organization. It looks like the Canadian government is looking into that classification now. How hopeful are you that this is going to go through?
Very good question. I have to admit that today I heard a slightly different tone from the Prime Minister and from the Foreign Affairs Minister. For a long time, they had simply said that this was not possible. Today, in their speeches at Richmond Hill, they indicated that they're open to the idea. They want to do it fairly, and they want to do it responsibly and in a way that doesn't harm ordinary people. So it seems like the door is open to something that myself and many other activists have been asking for a number of years.
And why is this classification so important to your community and to Iranians in general, particularly those living in Canada or living outside of Iran?
For two reasons. One symbolic and the other more practical. The symbolic reason is, the IRGC ought to be punished and ought to be recognized for all the harm that it's doing, the harm that it did with respect to shooting down this plane, with respect to all the killing it's done domestically, all the terror activities it's carried out abroad. And it's really important that it be recognized for the agent of destruction that it is globally. But practically speaking, even though the IRGC is on certain sanctions lists, it's still perfectly legitimate to be a member of the IRGC. Living in Canada, you can fundraise, you can do a great number of things for the IRGC. Listing it as a terror organization under our criminal code would allow this entire network connected to the IRGC to be criminalized and to be pursued by our authorities.
I have to ask you, Global Affairs about 2 months ago expressed deep concern about threats from Iran to the victims' families. Can you give us, do you know about this? Can you give us any examples of harassment that victims' families have actually been subjected to?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the cruelties of the Iranian regime is not only that it shot down the plane, not only did it lie about it and hide evidence, but for 4 years now, it's been engaged in this, intimidation posture where it has detained family members that have spoken out. It very recently prevented the family members of one of the sort of leading activists whose family were killed. It prevented his mother and father from coming to Canada. Barred them for about 6 months from traveling. And today the families inside Iran were trying to hold a ceremony, and this was under a very securitized environment in which they couldn't bring in other people. They had to operate under heavy guard. The entire atmosphere that the regime creates is one where they don't want to be responsive to the needs of the victims, and they don't want to allow them to demand justice, which is well within their rights.
So imprisoning, preventing travel, how concerned are you about these kinds of threats or actions on the part of Iran?
I'm deeply worried about it. This is a regime that has never hesitated to detain people, to arrest them, torture them, execute them when they've demanded justice. And I think the PS752 case really goes to the heart of the cruelty of the Islamic Republic. It shows their brutality, it shows their callousness, and the order for this shooting wasn't a low-level order. It came from the very top. So demanding justice means demanding accountability from the upper echelons of the regime. And so the regime will hesitate and will not hesitate to use violence against anyone that speaks out. So it's a very worrying situation.
I'm wondering about the legal process in terms of that downed flight. Countries like Canada, Sweden, Ukraine, and the UK have started that process against Iran in the International Civil Aviation Organization. How hopeful are you that they're going to see justice?
I am hopeful about this process. The ICAO, it's a bit of an obscure organization, so your viewers may not know. It's a bit of a political organization, and so the countries that will vote on whether or not Iran has violated the underlying convention will do so for political reasons. But there is recourse. If Canada and the other countries are dissatisfied with what ICAO does, they can refer the case to the International Court of Justice. So I'm hopeful that in the long term, perhaps not in the short term, but in the longer term, there will be some accountability. This is not a criminal court. It will be a civil action, but it will get the families one step closer to the truth, which is what they're seeking.
Okay, so outside of that civil action in the ICAO, as it's called, how else would you like to see Iran held to account?
So the families have taken an unusual step of asking the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate the downing of the flight. Now, traditionally, the ICC deals with matters referred to it by countries, by states. Canada and other countries haven't taken that action, regrettably, so the families have had to step forward. And what they're seeking is support, at least, from the Canadian government. Even if Canada's not willing to refer the case, they want at least the Canadian government to support the families in doing so. So that's an important step. And the other important step is one that we talked about earlier, which is the listing of the IRGC as a terror organization. I think both of those are important steps that Canada can take to support the families.
That was Kaveh Shahrouz. He is a human rights activist and lawyer and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's also a member of the Legal Advisory Committee for the families of PS752 victims, and we've reached him in Toronto tonight. Good to speak with you.
Thank you so much.